Bienvenidas to Latina Literati, the channel for Latinas and the Latina friendly. Today is spring. The birds are chirping, the flowers are blooming, and it's tax season. So I thought we would talk a little bit about what it means. What is a tax season? What is a tribute? Where does it come from? And what can we do to make it more just? The first tax documents that we have are on clay tablets from ancient Egypt, and some of them are as old as 5,000 years. So this has been a system that's been around for a long time. The central authority has been gathering tributes in those days in the form of grain or in the form of whatever it is that you manufactured. Let's say you manufactured amphora, which are the clay vessels in which olive oil and wine was transported. So the central authority at that point in ancient Egypt were the priests and the pharaoh, the royal house, and they would take 20% of whatever it is that you manufactured. In fact, the Rosetta Stone, the famous Rosetta Stone, was actually mostly a tax document. That's how important it was. And they kept a lot of really good records in terms of payments, in terms of what it was that people were expected to pay. And if you didn't pay your taxes in ancient Egypt, your property could be confiscated or you could be sold into slavery. So it was pretty important that people participate in this public funding of the common good. And so what does that mean? Well, for example, in ancient Egypt, when there was drought, then the royal granaries would release grain to the population to ensure that everyone had at least bread. And so taxes, for example, would be suspended. So it was a give and take. In other words, people would contribute, and in exchange they would receive, let's call it a social safety net should plague or other things occur. In those days, obviously, your children were your quote-unquote social security, so your children took care of parents in ancient Egypt. Let's talk a little bit about the Aztec tributary system. I always like to bring in our stories and our ancestors' stories. Under the Aztec tributary and taxation system, there were whole swaths of mid-Mexico that were part of what was called the Triple Alliance under Aztec rule. And so those lands, those city-states that were under the Triple Alliance needed to provide tribute to the center of the Aztec Empire, which was Tenochtitlan, and that's where the emperor resided. And in exchange for that, again, they received protection from any other city-states that might invade them. These tributes and taxes were paid every 80 days, every 6 months, or every 12 months, depending on what it was you were paying. So everybody paid. You either paid, for example, if you were a potter, you would pay in a portion of the pottery. If you were a farmer, you contributed a portion of what you grew. On the lush and famous chinampas, which were they still are there, man-made islands that are very fertile, very lush, and all sorts of crops are grown on them. Even to this day, there are special markets where you can go, and they say that the taste is much more delicious than, let's say, just normal farms, because they are in the shallow lake around what was originally Tenochtitlan. And so all of these boats would bring produce in to different markets. So the types of things that were grown on the chinampas were beans and maize and different types of squash, fruits and vegetables. But the most prized tribute was actually woven cloth. And so that gave women very high economic status, because if you were a good weaver, it was considered very precious, the cloth that you wove, and it was the greatest tribute from other city-states and or manner of payment. Even in the marketplace, you could take cloth and it would be accepted as what we would consider coin today. And again, if you didn't pay, your property would be confiscated and you would be sold. You might even be sold into slavery. So really interesting that there are societies around the world where the consequences of not paying your taxes seem to be quite similar. The great markets of what is now Mexico City, what was then Tenochtitlan, were called Tianquitzli. And even today, you can hear about people organizing tianguis, which comes from that original Nahuatl word. There were commercial courts that settled disputes, and there were commissioners that went around to ensure that no one was defrauded and there was no disturbance in the marketplace. That's how central it was. So when you went to the market, how did you pay for things? You paid for things with cacao beans, the woven cloth that we've spoken about, the woven cloth mentioned before, and also precious feathers. For example, from the sacred quetzal bird. Those were considered the most precious of all, but parrot feathers and other feathers also were traded as you would use coin today. It's interesting that there were land use contracts, there were oral contracts, and as long as there were 4 witnesses, they would be legally binding. Interest was illegal, but there is evidence that sometimes it was charged. So I think that's interesting too. Mayan kingdoms, it was very similar. Again, you had the tributary and taxation systems. You also had special causeways that were used to trade between city-states, and merchants would travel with warriors to protect their merchandise between the city-states. In the Inca Empire, in what is today modern Peru, you had Inca actually means people of the sun, and in lieu of taxation you had the concept of mita, which means public service. So it was a system of mandatory public service, not unlike Switzerland that requires every male citizen to give 2 years to the army, or Cuba in exchange for free education requires a certain number of months for you to work for the public good as well. So it's similar to some of the modern systems we have in countries today. In the great African kingdoms of Ghana and Mali, kinship united the communities and everything belonged basically to the community embodied in the ruler. So it's really important to remember that before the Europeans arrived to this continent, the only source or the major source of gold was Africa, which meant that the African kingdoms were made very, very rich by the trade. They also traded a lot of salt through the Sahara, and to the Middle East they traded enslaved peoples. And I think it's important to note that enslaved peoples could receive their freedom, and some of them even married into families where they were indentured or enslaved before. So a very different type of slavery. I'm not saying it's in any way better. There's no good slavery, but it's different than what happens when the enslaved peoples are brought to this continent. It's important to note that 3,000 years ago, during the Song dynasty of China, transitioned from a local economy to a market economy. And what does that mean? That means that instead of just producing goods for local areas, there were trading ships that went to all of the tributary areas, what is now Korea, what is now Japan, along the Indian Ocean, and traded. And the blue pottery that is known from the Song dynasty has been found literally around the world, in Australia, in South America. That's one of the many pieces of evidence that we know that trade from China occurred literally around the world. And during the Song dynasty, of course, there was taxation. Of course, there was tributes from other areas that were under Chinese protection. But it's interesting that the equivalent of clinics or hospitals were free to the public, and their education was also free based on merit. So it was a meritocracy, and there were very lucrative positions in the government that could be attained through examination. And so we're talking about 3,000 years of public education, which is pretty amazing. In almost all other societies, only the very elite would learn to read, and let alone participate in government. So it's pretty amazing to think about that for the last 3,000 years happening in China. Afterwards, of course, China then closes from the world, but during the Song Dynasty, they actually were open and did a lot of trading, a lot of commercial trading with everyone. So in looking at all of these systems and looking at all of these different beginnings of human society and that contribution of resources in exchange for things, I think it's important that we look at what does the central power represent and what do they give back. Every year we all participate in a system where we give a certain percentage of what we make. Whether we're an employee or we have our own business, you have to provide details of your income and then you give a percentage to the central power. So in exchange for these resources, what is it that we receive? We would expect to receive protection. So do you feel safe? We would expect to receive a functioning infrastructure. Do we have a functioning infrastructure? Do we have, for example, bullet trains like every other industrialized nation on earth? We would expect to have access to healthcare. Having been to other countries and every once in a while when you travel with children, you have to go to the doctor. I'm always shocked at how the absolute most important thing is the doctor spending time with the patient, not all the insurance protocols and not all of the billing. They never ask you for anything. For example, in Canada, we went to the emergency and it was a flat 100 Canadian dollars because we were non-Canadian. So that's just an example. What I'm saying is that in all of the industrialized societies and even those in the developing world, there's access to public health care. And that's one of the basic human rights and something that we should insist on. We also expect access to education. Free public education in the Western world is only about 200 years old, and it really was in Germany where they realized, factory workers might work better if they actually knew how to read and write. And so the reason why we have public education today is not to create critical thinkers, but rather to ensure that there's a basic level for the workforce. And so in other countries, for example, in the US, approximately 25% will take some higher education courses. In Europe, it's double that, it's over 50%. In countries like Central America, it's about 5%. Having access to free education should be a central tenet of what is received in exchange for the resources that every one of us contributes to the central government. In the description box, I will leave a study that was done. It's from 2019 with regard to areas that pay more taxes than they receive. There was actually a woman who developed a program where you could type in your zip code and know how much that zip code paid to the federal government and how much it received back. And the entire thing was taken down by the federal government. In general, the more prosperous states pay much more than those states that are less prosperous. So I'm not going to go into saying red, blue, green, purple. I'm just saying if everyone is paying their fair share, because if you make $1,000 and you pay 10%, that's a lot. But if you make $1 billion and you pay 10%, that's not a lot. You can still live very well on what's left. And so that's the concept, that everybody should pay their fair share. No one should be a millionaire or a billionaire and not pay taxes. That's just not logical for the common good. So about 50 years ago, 80% of the taxes were paid by entities like corporations. The tax rate was 3 times what it is today for them. And I'm talking about, for example, under Eisenhower, right? Republican president. Today, 90% of the income to the central federal government comes from individuals. So you see how it's flipped. So that definitely seems to be on its head. Taxation could be really simple. It doesn't have to be as complicated as it's made, but you can imagine that there are millions and millions of dollars charged in the preparation of taxes, and so all those entities that help you prepare taxes are going to fight every time the government could just send you a bill. I mean, because once you upload the forms, they would know what your income is. So again, it could be much simpler, and I think simplicity and transparency are our friends, but not necessarily the friends of the governing interests, right? So I think that's definitely something that we need to push for as well. So what does the government take in? In the United States, for example, in 2019, the federal government took in $3.5 trillion. And that's a lot of money. In fact, it's an almost incomprehensible amount of money. And to think that we can't solve the problems that we have with that amount of money just is not logical. And so the only answer is that the money is being invested in things that are not the common good. And so that's something else that needs to change. We can't continue to use all of our funds for things that don't benefit us. First, April includes Public Library Week. Yay! And so if you haven't checked out your public library recently, you should. They're back, they're open. So happy to have them back. And all their wonderful programming for you and the whole family. Also, April is Financial Literacy month. And so I will also leave in the description box a couple of links, just because we all ought to know and talk about and think about things like investments and savings and wealth management, because if not for us, then for our children, we need to plan and ensure that they're taken care of and have some basic things that they'll need. So I invite you to take a look at those links, and hopefully they'll be of some help to you or inspire you as they have inspired me. So now on to the book recommendations. Yay! The first book recommendation is Invisible Heart by Nancy Forbes. And this is a really interesting book. It's from the female perspective, and it talks about care and reciprocity. What does that mean? Well, we know that most of the work on Earth, on the entire Earth, most of the work is done by women, and most of it is unpaid. So what does it mean when the central government doesn't recognize the majority of work being done? So when we care for others, whether it's our parents, family members, friends, neighbors, children, whatever, it's work. And it's, in some countries it is recognized as work and you receive a paycheck for it. And in other countries it's just kind of ignored. And as the traditional caretakers have had more opportunities and more education and have gone on to other ways of living, then who is taking care of those that traditionally need to be cared for, right? Usually the elderly, the young, and everyone in between, really, because we all need to be cared for. So the second book is called Economics and Belonging. Again, what it does is it takes a look at the traditional inequality and injustices, and then takes a look at changes that we should make in order to make things better for everyone. So economic policy basically provides for poverty. And so if we change economic policy and we change the way that taxation is applied, we can literally do away with poverty. And an example was the child tax credit that was allowed by Congress to lapse, and that literally lifted, 30-40% of children in the United States that were in poverty out of poverty. Something as simple as that. So really interesting to just take a look at how easy the solutions are. They're there. All we have to do is apply them. This is not rocket science. This is really simple. All we need is political will. We know what we need to do to get political will, because all politics is local. We need to start at the local level and just pressure and push and support and ensure that we're very clear in our goals that we need to change things. It's not okay for our neighbors not to have enough, because there's enough for everyone. The final book recommendation is Democracy in Peril. And again, this kind of takes a step back and says, what happens when the traditional tax policy on the international level is pulled back by things like free trade treaties, when countries that are developing no longer have the traditional tariffs and taxation, the taxation structures many times are weak, then they don't have the income for basic structural needs. So basic social needs, infrastructure, education, healthcare. And so what globalization What globalization truly means is the movement of capital by the powerful, right? And the stripping of capital from the poor and the needy. And so it's really interesting to take a look at how these international treaties, so for example, the largest companies can do anything they want, Canada, US, and Mexico. In my own personal experience, I tried to send a breast pump to my sister-in-law after NAFTA took effect, and 3 different ministries would have had to approve this little breast pump be mailed to her through DHL. So that's the kind of imbalance that you see. So all of the major companies can move capital back and forth. They can move their executives back and forth. They can set up wherever it's best for them. But you as an individual, that doesn't make it any easier to help your people, to help your family, to do anything. So it's, again, really interesting to take a look at who these treaties really benefit. And if there's some real treaties, like, for example, European integration, then people should be able to move anywhere they want, right? Freedom of goods and people. It shouldn't be just capital of the wealthy. So again, I really recommend the books. I'll link them all down below. And thank you so much for coming to the end of the video and for being on this journey with us. We'll bring you some new videos soon. As always, I wish you felicidad, salud y mucho amor. Gracias.